The fire crackled, a tame and disciplined beast behind the polished brass screen of the cavernous fireplace. It threw flickering light across the room, making the shadows of priceless sculptures dance on walls lined with silk. In her throne-like leather armchair, Eleanor Vance watched the small girl standing before her. The girl, Lily, was a study in contrasts to the opulent room. Her school uniform was impeccably clean but worn at the cuffs, her black shoes polished but scuffed at the toes. She stood with a stillness that was unusual for a child of 8, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, her gaze direct and unnervingly steady. Eleanor swirled the amber liquid in her crystal glass, the ice clinking like a distant lonely bell. A smile, thin and sharp as a shard of glass, touched her lips. "So," she said, her voice a low purr that had sealed billion-dollar deals and dismantled corporate rivals. She raised a single, perfectly manicured finger, a gesture of casual, absolute power. "3 wishes, child, anything your little heart desires. A pony, a trip to see the mouse in his kingdom, name it, and it is yours." The offer was a whim, a fleeting moment of entertainment in a day otherwise filled with the monotonous hum of her vast empire. She saw the girl not as a person, but as a curiosity, a small, simple creature, from a world so far beneath her own, it was almost exotic. What would a gardener's daughter wish for? The question amused her. But this moment, thick with the scent of old money and new tension, did not begin here. To understand the quiet power gathering in Lily's small frame, one had to go back 2 days, to a world that existed in the shadows of Eleanor Vance's gilded reality. Eleanor's life was a fortress of control. Her name, a titan of industry, was whispered with a mixture of fear and awe from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Her net worth was a staggering, almost abstract number, a constellation of tens of billions of dollars that insulated her from the messiness of ordinary human existence. She moved through the world in a hermetically sealed bubble of private jets, armored town cars, and sprawling estates where the staff moved with the silent, efficient grace of ghosts. People, to Eleanor, were assets or liabilities, pieces on a grand chessboard she had been playing and winning her entire life. Her estate in upstate New York was less a home and more a monument to her ambition, its manicured acres a testament to a world bent to her will. Among the small army of staff who maintained this monument was Miguel, Lily's father. He was the head gardener, a man whose hands, calloused and stained with the earth he so lovingly tended, were more honest than any contract Eleanor had ever signed. He was quiet, meticulous, and possessed a dignity that seemed to spring from the soil itself. Because he could not afford after-school care on his modest salary, Lily often spent her afternoons in the estate's vast, stainless steel kitchen, a silent observer doing her homework at a small wooden table, while the chefs prepared meals Eleanor would likely pick at and discard. It was in that kitchen that Lily had learned to watch, to listen. The day before, hidden from view by a tall rack of copper pots, she had seen her father approach Mr. Davenport, the estate manager, in his sterile glass-walled office. Miguel's shoulders were slumped with a weight Lily had never seen before. His voice was low, humble, laced with a quiet desperation that made her own stomach tighten. "Mr. Davenport, sir," he'd begun, twisting the worn cap in his hands. "I would not ask if it were not an emergency. My Lily, she has a tooth, a bad infection. The dentist says she needs a procedure, an urgent one." He swallowed hard. "I was hoping. Is it possible to get a small advance, just a few $100s? They would take it from my next pay, of course." Mr. Davenport, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced with a steel rod, did not even look up from his computer screen. "Miguel," he said, his voice flat and dismissive, "you know the policy, no advances. It creates a precedent. Budget your finances more effectively." He waved a hand, a flick of the wrist that erased Miguel's entire world of worry. "That will be all." Her father had simply nodded, his face a mask of quiet shame, and walked away. Lily had felt a hot, unfamiliar anger rise in her chest. A few $100s. It was nothing. Less than the cost of one of the floral arrangements that was replaced daily in the grand foyer. If you've ever felt that burning sting of injustice, that helplessness, when dignity is dismissed by a flick of the wrist, let me know you're here by tapping that like button. The world needs to know these stories matter. Minutes after her father's defeated exit, a flurry of activity had erupted in the estate's main hall. A television crew bustled in, setting up bright lights and cameras. Eleanor Vance, looking impeccable in a sapphire blue suit, descended the grand staircase. Lily watched from the shadows of a connecting corridor as Eleanor stood before the cameras, her expression one of serene, benevolent charity. "It is my profound honor," Eleanor announced to the reporter, her voice smooth as silk, "to announce a donation of $3 million to the new pediatric research wing at St. Jude's Hospital. Our children are our future, and we must invest in them above all else." The reporter smiled fawningly. The cameras flashed, and Lily stood perfectly still, the two scenes playing over and over in her mind. Her father's desperate plea for a few $100s to fix her pain met with a cold bureaucratic wall, and Eleanor's grand, celebrated gift of millions broadcast for the entire world to see. In that moment, the 8-year-old girl understood something profound and terrible about the world. She understood that for some people, money was a tool for performance, not a means of help. And a quiet, unshakable resolve settled in her heart. Now standing on the priceless Persian rug in front of the crackling fire, Lily looked at the most powerful woman she had ever known. She saw the condescending amusement in Eleanor's eyes, the casual arrogance of her offer. Eleanor was expecting a wish for a toy, for a fantasy. She was playing a game. But Lily wasn't playing. She took a small, steadying breath, the scent of burning oak and expensive perfume filling her lungs. The silence stretched, amplifying the soft tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner. Eleanor's smile began to falter, replaced by a flicker of impatience. "Well?" she prodded. "Have you thought of something, child? I don't have all day." Lily met her gaze, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something in the child's eyes that wasn't fear or awe. It was clarity, a focus so intense it was unnerving. When Lily finally spoke, her voice was not the whisper Eleanor expected. It was clear, calm, and carried a weight that seemed to press all the air out of the magnificent room. Eleanor Vance, a woman who could divine the future of the stock market from a whisper and a spreadsheet, found herself for the first time in decades utterly without a script. She had expected a child's wish, a simple transaction, a dollhouse the size of a small car, a pony with a ribbon in its mane, a trip to that gaudy theme park in Florida where everything was plastic and loud. She had the checkbook of her mind already open, the numbers ready to be written, the satisfaction of a grand, dismissive gesture already warming her. Instead, Lily's voice, as clear and steady as a bell in the cavernous room, delivered a sentence that was not a request, but a verdict. "My first wish," Lily stated, her gaze unwavering, "is for you to truly help someone with your own hands, without cameras, without money, and without revealing who you are." The words did not just hang in the air, they displaced it. Eleanor felt a sudden, strange vacuum, a silence so profound it was almost a sound. Her mind, a finely tuned engine of leverage and acquisition, stalled. This was a problem for which she had no currency. It was an algorithm she couldn't solve. Her power, her influence, her very name, all the tools that had carved her empire out of the world, were rendered useless, as irrelevant as a pile of gold to a drowning woman. For a long, stretched-out moment, she could only stare at the small girl, whose seriousness felt ancient and unnerving. A promise was a contract. She had made a verbal agreement, and in Eleanor's world, one's word was a bond, if only for the sake of reputation. To renege on a promise to a child, her gardener's daughter no less, would be a display of weakness, a crack in the marble facade. A flicker of something else stirred within her as well, a nettlesome, unfamiliar curiosity. It was a challenge, and Eleanor Vance had never backed down from a challenge. "Very well," she said, her voice a clipped, foreign sound in her own ears. The words felt like sandpaper in her throat. "Tomorrow." The next morning, Eleanor stood before her walk-in closet, a space larger than Lily's entire home, and felt a wave of helplessness. What did one wear to be invisible? Every garment she owned was a statement, a carefully chosen piece of armor woven from silk, cashmere, and power. She eventually settled on a pair of plain dark trousers and a simple grey sweater she recalled a former assistant leaving behind. The fabric felt coarse against her skin, a constant irritating reminder of the charade. Without her signature jewelry, without the subtle scent of her $500 an ounce perfume, without the precise architecture of her hair and makeup, she felt stripped, not of her wealth but of her identity. She was a ghost in her own life. Lily was waiting by the service entrance, her school backpack slung over her shoulder, her expression patient. She led Eleanor not to one of the gleaming black town cars, but to a public bus stop just beyond the estate's imposing iron gates. The bus wheezed to a halt, its air brakes hissing in protest. Inside, it smelled of damp wool, stale coffee, and the faint metallic scent of indifference. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She watched the city she owned blur past the grimy window, no longer a kingdom to be commanded, but a chaotic, anonymous landscape. They arrived at a low-slung brick building with a faded sign that read, Northwood Community Shelter. The air inside was a physical assault. It was thick with the smells of boiled cabbage, industrial-strength disinfectant, and an underlying, deeply human scent of unwashed bodies and quiet desperation. People shuffled along the scuffed linoleum floors, their faces etched with a weariness that went bone deep. Eleanor felt a visceral urge to recoil, to hold a silk handkerchief to her nose and flee back to the filtered air of her penthouse. A stern-faced woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Brenda barely glanced at Eleanor. She saw only a new volunteer, another pair of hands. "You can start in the kitchen," Brenda said, pointing with her chin. "We've got 1,000 pounds of potatoes to get through before lunch." The kitchen was a cacophony of clanging metal and hissing steam. Eleanor was handed a peeler, a small, cheap-looking instrument that felt clumsy and alien in her grasp. Her hands, accustomed to the smooth, cool weight of a Mont Blanc pen or the delicate stem of a crystal flute, fumbled with the rough skin of a potato. The first few strips she carved were thick and wasteful. A man working beside her, his arms a tapestry of faded tattoos, grunted. "Like this, lady," he said not unkindly, and demonstrated the quick, efficient motion. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at Eleanor. She, who advised heads of state on economic policy, was being schooled on peeling a potato. Hours later, her hands were raw, her back ached with a dull fire she'd never known, and the nail on her right index finger, which had been manicured to perfection just 2 days prior, was chipped and dirty. Brenda then moved her to the serving line. A stainless steel ladle was thrust into her hand. Her job was to scoop a grey, lukewarm stew into chipped ceramic bowls. This was harder than the potatoes. Here she had to look at them, the faces. A young mother, her eyes hollowed out with fear, trying to coax her toddler to eat. An old man whose hands trembled so violently he could barely hold his tray. A teenage boy who stared at the stew with a look of profound defeat. Each person was a story of loss and struggle, a story she had only ever encountered as a statistic in a philanthropic proposal. She tried to maintain her composure, to treat it as a mechanical task, but their eyes kept finding hers. In them she saw not a request for pity, but a simple, devastating need to be seen as human. Eleanor watched Lily move through the crowded room, her own discomfort momentarily forgotten. The child was not helping in the way Eleanor understood it. She wasn't performing a task. She was simply present. She sat with an elderly woman and listened, her head cocked to one side, as the woman spoke in a rambling whisper. She helped a little boy tie his shoe. A single hot tear pricked the corner of Eleanor's eye, a betrayal she could not suppress. What was this unfamiliar ache in her chest? It felt like a cavity, a hollow space she never knew she had. Then came the moment that shattered everything. As a small reward for their help, Brenda gave Lily a pair of brand new, thick wool socks. Lily's face lit up with a genuine, unadulterated joy that Eleanor hadn't seen in a boardroom in 30 years. She clutched them to her chest like a treasure. But just as she was about to put them in her backpack, her eyes landed on an old man huddled in a corner, his body racked with shivers, his bare feet blue and raw against the cold floor. Eleanor watched, frozen. She saw the flicker of conflict on Lily's face, the simple, childish desire for her new thing, warring with something else. The battle lasted only a second. Without a word, Lily walked over to the man. She knelt on the grimy floor, her small hands unwrapping the socks. "Sir," she said softly, "your feet look cold. Please, take these." The man looked up, his eyes clouded with confusion, and saw the small girl offering him her gift. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, a slow, painful movement of his head. Lily didn't just hand them to him. She gently took one of his cracked, swollen feet in her hands and carefully, tenderly slid the warm sock over it. The simple, unscripted act of pure, selfless generosity was a hammer blow to Eleanor's soul. It was not a transaction. It was not for a tax receipt or a press release. There were no cameras, no applause. It was just one human being seeing the suffering of another and offering the only comfort they had to give. In that single, silent moment, Eleanor Vance understood. Her multi-million-dollar donations, the hospital wings and university libraries that bore her name, they were monuments to her own ego. They were acts of power. This was an act of grace. The bus ride back to the estate was silent. The sterile, opulent grandeur of her home felt garish and offensive when she finally walked through the door. The smell of stew and disinfectant seemed to cling to her expensive clothes, a phantom scent reminding her of the world she had just left. She was physically exhausted, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache, but her mind was reeling, disoriented, grappling with the raw humanity she had been forced to witness. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was only the first wish. And she had no idea how she would survive the second. The meticulously ordered world of Eleanor Vance had developed a fracture. It was a hairline crack invisible to the naked eye, yet she felt it in the hollow echo of her own footsteps on the polished marble floors of her estate. The usual hum of satisfaction she derived from reviewing quarterly reports had been replaced by a low, persistent thrum of unease. Numbers, once the only language that held absolute meaning for her, now seemed flat and lifeless. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument for market prediction and ruthless negotiation, kept replaying unwanted images from the community shelter, the grit under her fingernails, the desperate gratitude in a stranger's eyes, the pure, uncalculated kindness of a little girl offering a pair of socks. The memory of it was a foreign object lodged in her consciousness, something her formidable intellect could neither categorize nor dismiss. She was in her home office, a vast room of mahogany and glass overlooking 1,000 manicured acres, when Lily appeared at the doorway. The child stood there, a quiet, unassuming figure against the grandeur of the room, her school shoes perfectly aligned on the edge of the priceless Persian rug. She didn't speak, she simply waited, knowing she would be seen. Eleanor swiveled in her leather chair, the smooth motion doing nothing to calm the disquiet within her. "Yes, Lily?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been a week ago. Lily stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back. "It's time for my second wish," as she said, her tone not demanding, but stating a simple, unavoidable fact. A strange new sense of compulsion, an unacknowledged desire to follow this bizarre path to its conclusion, had replaced Eleanor's initial arrogance. She was no longer playing a game with a child. She felt as though she were a participant in a profound, unsettling lesson she had yet to comprehend. "And what is it?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward, her elbows resting on the gleaming desk where she had signed deals worth more than the GDP of small nations. "My second wish," Lily said, her gaze unwavering, "is that you visit the hospital, the one you gave all that money to, the Eleanor Vance Children's Wing." She paused, letting the weight of the name hang in the air between them. "But you will not go as Eleanor Vance. You will go as no one, an anonymous visitor, just like everyone else." The request was an echo of the first, another demand for anonymity, another stripping away of the armor she had spent a lifetime building. But this time, Eleanor felt no resistance, only a strange, compelling curiosity. She wanted to see the monument to her own generosity through a different lens. She simply nodded. "I will go tomorrow." The following morning, dressed once more in unassuming clothes, a simple grey sweater, dark trousers, and comfortable flat shoes she'd had her assistant purchase, Eleanor walked through the automatic glass doors of the state-of-the-art medical facility. Above the entrance, carved into a slab of Italian marble, were the words, "The Eleanor Vance Children's Wing." Her name, a brand, a symbol of power and philanthropy. But today she was just a woman in a grey sweater, another anonymous face in a sea of worried parents and harried staff. No one looked at her twice. The invisibility was both unnerving and liberating. She walked the pristine, hauntingly quiet corridors. The air smelled of antiseptic and a faint, indefinable sweetness. The silence was punctuated by the distant, rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional soft cry of a child from behind a closed door. She saw the true, suffocating weight of human helplessness etched onto the faces of the people she passed. She saw a young mother, her face pale and drawn, staring blankly at a coffee she wasn't drinking. She saw a father, his broad shoulders slumped, whispering reassurances into a cell phone. This was the raw, untelevised reality of her donation. It wasn't about plaques and press conferences. It was about this silent, shared suffering. As she rounded a corner, she overheard two nurses speaking in hushed, tired tones by a supply closet. "Another photo op next week," one said, rolling her eyes. "They just installed that new MRI, but did they hire another tech to run it? Of course not. We have a 3-week backlog, but the machine looks great in the brochure." The other nurse sighed, adjusting her glasses. "Tell me about it. All that donation money, and half of it seems to go into PR and naming rights. We've been asking for 6 more pediatric nurses for a year. But I guess nurses don't look as good on a gala invitation as a shiny new machine." The words struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Her illusion of impactful philanthropy shattered. She had been funding an image, a legacy, not necessarily the direct, messy human work of healing. She had written a check and outsourced the humanity, assuming the two were the same. The shame was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. Reeling, she continued down the hall. Her purpose for being there suddenly sharpened. She wasn't just an observer, she was an auditor of her own soul. Her eyes fell on a small boy, perhaps 7 years old, sitting up in his bed in a shared room. He was pale, a thin tube taped to the back of his hand, and he was staring listlessly at a broken video game controller he clutched. It was a cheap, plastic thing, cracked down the middle, the buttons unresponsive. An impulse, raw and unfamiliar, surged through Eleanor. It was not the impulse to buy, to replace, to solve the problem with money. It was the urge to fix, to connect. She walked quietly into the room. The boy didn't look up. "Is it broken?" Eleanor asked softly. The boy gave a small, defeated nod, not making eye contact. "May I see it?" He hesitated for a moment, then handed it to her. Eleanor examined the cracked plastic. In her world, this would be instantly discarded, replaced with a newer, better model. Here, in this small, sterile room, it was a lifeline to a world outside of sickness, and it was broken. Driven by a purpose she couldn't articulate, she looked around the room. She saw a discarded delivery box in the recycling bin. She walked over, tore off a sturdy piece of cardboard, and then went to the nurse's station, her voice quiet as she asked for a roll of medical tape. She returned to the boy's bedside and, with a painstaking patience she hadn't known she possessed, she began to work. Her fingers, accustomed to the smooth glass of a smartphone screen and the crisp edges of a stock certificate, carefully fashioned a splint from the cardboard, reinforcing the cracked controller from the inside. She used the tape to bind the plastic shell back together, her movements precise and focused. It was clumsy, makeshift, and utterly inelegant, but she worked until the buttons clicked again, until the device felt solid in her hands. It took her nearly 20 minutes. When she was finished, she handed it back to the boy. He took it, his small fingers tracing the lines of tape. He pressed a button. It clicked. He pressed another. A small, wondrous light flickered on the controller. His eyes, dull and listless moments before, slowly widened. He looked up at Eleanor, and a genuine smile spread across his face, a small, radiant dawn of forgotten joy. It was a smile that no amount of money, no grand donation, no wing named in her honor could ever have purchased. In that instant, Eleanor finally, truly understood. The boy's fragile smile was a beacon, cutting through the dense fog of her carefully constructed world. It was then she realized Lily's first wish wasn't just about helping. It was about truly seeing. Seeing the need not for $1 million machine, but for a piece of tape. Seeing the person, not the project. The warmth that spread through her chest was more profound and satisfying than any successful acquisition. It was the feeling of a genuine human connection, a value that could not be quantified on any balance sheet. She left the hospital and walked back towards her waiting car. The city's noise a distant hum. The warmth of the boy's smile lingered, a quiet fire inside her. Her perception of value, of wealth, of her own purpose had been irrevocably altered. She knew with a certainty that chilled and thrilled her in equal measure that the third and most challenging wish was yet to come. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what she might lose. She was electrified by what she might become. The silence in the grand sunlit room felt different now. It was no longer the empty, sterile silence of a life lived at a distance, but a quiet, charged space, brimming with unspoken anticipation. Eleanor Vance, seated in her custom-upholstered armchair, found herself leaning forward. A posture of genuine engagement she hadn't assumed in years outside of a boardroom takeover. The revulsion and shame she had felt at the shelter, the profound, humbling warmth she had experienced at the hospital, they had tilled the soil of her soul, leaving it strangely receptive. She looked at Lily, who stood before her not as an employee's child, but as a small, unwavering arbiter of truth. A profound shift had occurred within Eleanor. She was no longer dreading the next challenge, but was drawn to it, pulled by an unfamiliar current of wanting to know, to understand, to feel what came next. Lily's eyes, clear and deep, held a wisdom that seemed to have been borrowed from an ancient well. "My third wish," she declared, her voice as steady as a heartbeat, "is for you to spend an entire day without your money, without your phone, and without your influence. You must survive only by your own work, whatever that may be." The words were an echo of the first two wishes, yet they represented the final, absolute demolition of her identity. To be without money was to be without power. To be without her phone was to be without connection to the empire she commanded. To be without influence was to be simply Eleanor. A ghost of her old self might have scoffed, dismissed it as a childish fantasy. But the woman who sat there now, the woman who had felt the desperate grip of a homeless man's gratitude and the radiant joy in a sick child's smile, felt a tremor, not of fear, but of strange, exhilarating readiness. This was the final test, the complete immersion. She nodded slowly, the gesture feeling more significant than any contract she had ever signed. "I accept." The following morning, before the sun had fully crested the rolling hills of her estate, Eleanor stood by a side gate, dressed in a pair of simple, ill-fitting jeans and a plain grey t-shirt purchased by a bewildered household manager. She had $50 in cash in her pocket, a concession Lily had made, calling it seed money, and nothing else, no phone, no credit cards, no driver. The air was crisp, and for the first time Eleanor felt its bite not as an inconvenience to be shielded from, but as a stark reality. She walked through the gate and onto the public road, the heavy iron closing behind her, with a definitive clang that sounded like the shutting of a tomb, or perhaps the opening of a new world. The city was an overwhelming assault on her senses. The cacophony of sirens, horns, and the indistinct roar of a million lives being lived in parallel was a physical force. She, who was accustomed to moving through the world in a bubble of silent, air-conditioned luxury, felt buffeted and insignificant. People streamed past her, their faces set in masks of purpose or worry, their eyes sliding over her without a flicker of recognition. She was invisible. The feeling was no longer a theoretical concept explored in a shelter. It was a cold, hard fact. Hunger, a sensation she had only ever known as a mild, fleeting signal that a chef-prepared meal was imminent, began as a hollow ache and soon became a sharp, demanding pang in her stomach. The $50 felt both like a fortune and like nothing at all. She knew she needed to find work, to earn a meal, to fulfill the terms of the wish. She walked into a chic boutique, the kind of place where she might have once spent thousands without a thought, and timidly asked if they needed any help for the day, perhaps stocking shelves. The manager, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a dismissive smile, gave her a single sweeping glance that took in her cheap clothes and anxious posture. "We're not hiring," she said, her tone making it clear that Eleanor was not the kind of person they would ever hire. The rejection was a small, sharp sting. She tried a bookstore, a coffee shop, a flower stand. The answer was always the same, a polite but firm no, each one chipping away at her resolve. The city, which had once felt like her personal chessboard, now seemed a fortress with its walls turned against her. Hours passed. Her feet, clad in thin-soled sneakers, ached with a deep, unfamiliar pain. The sun beat down and the gnawing in her stomach became a dizzying weakness. She was just another face in the immense, struggling crowd, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had until yesterday been hers to command. Finally, her hope dwindling, she turned down a side street and saw it. A small, family-run diner, its windows steamy, a sign written in faded black marker taped to the glass. "Help wanted." It wasn't a request, it was a plea. Taking a deep breath that did little to steady her trembling hands, Eleanor pushed open the door. The smell of frying bacon, old coffee, and warm bread enveloped her. A kind-faced woman with tired eyes and flour on her apron looked up from behind the counter. Her name tag read, Maria. "Can I help you?" Maria asked, her voice weary but not unkind. Eleanor's own voice was a dry rasp. "Your sign. She swallowed, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on her tongue. "I'm looking for work. I'll do anything. I need a meal." Maria looked at her skeptically, her gaze assessing. She saw not a billionaire, but a woman on the edge, her desperation raw and undisguised. Something in Eleanor's eyes, a flicker of an old authority now humbled into a genuine plea, seemed to convince her. She sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. The dishwasher called in sick. Again. You know how to wash dishes. Eleanor thought of the automated industrial machines in her own estate's kitchen. "Yes," she lied, with a conviction that surprised herself. The rest of the day was a blur of sweltering heat, steam, and the relentless clang of plates and cutlery. The small kitchen was a furnace, and Eleanor was plunged into its heart. Her hands, which had only known the smooth touch of silk, leather, and stock certificates, were submerged in greasy, scalding water. She scrubbed at hardened egg yolk and dried gravy, her muscles screaming in protest. The rhythmic, hurried shouts of orders, "2 eggs over easy," "Burger, no onions," became the soundtrack to her labor. She learned the weight of a stack of heavy ceramic plates, the burn of steam on her face, the deep, satisfying ache of physical exhaustion. It was grueling, mindless, and the most real thing she had ever done. As the evening rush subsided, Maria placed a plate on a small stool in the corner of the kitchen. It held a simple meal, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Eleanor sank onto the stool, her back a knot of pain, her clothes soaked with sweat and dishwater. She picked up the fork with a hand that trembled from fatigue and took a bite. The food was simple, unadorned, and it was, without question, the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It was more satisfying than any 7-course meal at a Michelin-starred restaurant because she had earned it. Every bite was a reward for the ache in her spine, the raw skin on her hands, the sweat on her brow. When she was done, she washed her own plate and handed Maria the $50. The woman pushed it back. "You earned your meal today," she said simply. "Keep it." The walk back to the estate was a slow, painful pilgrimage. The cheap sneakers had given out, a hole worn clean through one sole, and the rough pavement scraped against her bare foot. She was dirty, disheveled, and smelled of grease and exhaustion. As she finally reached the familiar side gate, she saw a small figure illuminated by the soft glow of the kitchen porch light. It was Lily, waiting for her. Eleanor limped the final few yards and stopped before the child. She had been stripped of everything, her name, her wealth, her power, and in the process had found a part of herself she never knew was missing. She looked at Lily, at the calm, knowing gaze that held no judgment, only a quiet understanding. In that moment, Eleanor Vance, the titan of industry, the woman who could command nations with a word, was truly speechless. There were no words to describe the chasm she had crossed, She had been sent into the wilderness a queen and had returned a beggar, feeling more alive, more connected to the raw, pulsating heart of humanity than she ever had in her gilded cage. The financial world did not erupt in a blaze of headlines, but rather it rippled with a series of quiet seismic shocks. In hushed conference rooms high above Wall Street, seasoned lawyers and silver-haired fund managers stared at encrypted emails with expressions of profound disbelief. Eleanor Vance, the apex predator of their ecosystem, was liquidating. Not reallocating, not diversifying, but methodically, deliberately divesting a significant portion of the personal fortune that had been her armor and her weapon for decades. There were no press releases, no grand announcements. The transactions were executed with surgical precision, leaving a trail of baffled whispers and frantic speculation in their wake. Her inner circle, the people who had built careers on anticipating her every move, were left utterly adrift. They called, they emailed, they tried to decipher the sudden, inexplicable shift in her strategy, but Eleanor, for the first time in her life, was not playing their game. She was dismantling the board. Her sprawling estate in upstate New York, once a monument to impenetrable wealth, became the epicenter of this quiet revolution. The towering wrought-iron gates, which had once seemed designed to keep the world out, were swung permanently open. Instead of an army of landscapers meticulously manicuring acres of ornamental gardens for the benefit of one woman, crews of construction workers arrived. They moved with a different kind of purpose, their laughter echoing where once there had only been the whisper of wind through ancient oaks. The East Wing, with its ballroom that had hosted international dignitaries, was gutted. Its gilded ceilings and crystal chandeliers were carefully removed, not to be sold but to be replaced with bright, clean lighting and walls painted in warm, inviting tones. Soundproofed rooms for counseling, a state-of-the-art computer lab, and a spacious, sunlit daycare began to take shape where priceless tapestries had once hung. The former community shelter, the grimy, desperate place that had first cracked the veneer of Eleanor's soul, was not just funded, it was absorbed. Its residents and staff were moved into temporary, comfortable housing while the old building was razed to the ground. In its place, and connected to the main house by a beautiful glass-enclosed walkway, rose the heart of the new endeavor. It was a dining hall and resource center, built with dignity and light, where a hot meal was not a handout but a shared moment of community. The entire complex, from the old mansion to the new facilities, was quietly chartered and endowed under a new name, one that never appeared in any society pages. There was a small, simple bronze plaque affixed to the stone archway of the main entrance, polished but unassuming. It read, "The Miguel and Lily Center for Community." Eleanor Vance, the woman whose time had once been billed in $5,000 increments, now measured her days in different currency. She could be found most mornings in the center's kitchen, not as an observer but with an apron tied around her waist, her sleeves rolled up. She learned the names of everyone who came through the line, their stories, the small triumphs and persistent struggles of their lives. She never offered pity, she offered respect. She would listen to a young mother's anxieties about a job interview and then spend the afternoon in the computer lab helping her draft a resume. Her legendary business acumen now repurposed to empower a single life. She was no longer a magnate pulling levers from a distance. She was simply Eleanor, a pair of hands, a listening ear, a quiet force for practical good. One afternoon, she saw Miguel walking across the newly planted central lawn, his smile wider and more relaxed than she had ever seen it. He had received the extensive dental work he needed, paid for by an anonymous grant from the center's foundation, a transaction so discreet that he never had to feel the weight of charity from his former employer. He now oversaw the center's expansive vegetable gardens, which supplied the kitchen with fresh produce. He was no longer just a gardener tending to a rich woman's vanity project. He was a provider, cultivating food that nourished hundreds. He stopped to show Eleanor a perfectly ripened tomato, his hands still calloused, holding it out with a simple, honest pride. In his eyes, Eleanor saw not gratitude but partnership. It was a look of shared purpose that was worth more to her than any stock portfolio. Her relationship with Lily deepened into something sacred and unspoken. The little girl was the unofficial heart of the center, her bright spirit a constant presence after school. She would read to the younger children in the daycare, or sit with the elderly residents, listening to their stories with an attention that made them feel seen and valued. Eleanor and Lily often spent the late afternoons together, not in the cavernous kitchen of the old estate, but in a small greenhouse Miguel had built behind the main hall. They would work side by side, repotting seedlings, their hands in the same rich soil. They rarely spoke of the three wishes. There was no need. The wishes had not been a game or a transaction. They had been a key, unlocking a door inside Eleanor she never knew existed. "You know," Lily said one day, her small fingers gently firming the soil around a fragile sprout, "I never wished for you to give all your money away." Eleanor paused, looking at the child's serious, upturned face. "I know," she replied softly. "That was never the point, was it?" "No," Lily said, her gaze clear and wise. "The point was for you to find something the money couldn't buy." Eleanor felt a familiar ache in her chest, but it was no longer the sting of shame or the pang of an unfamiliar emotion. It was the warmth of fullness, the profound peace of a soul that had finally come home to itself. She looked out through the glass of the greenhouse. She could see the entire center humming with life. Children were playing on a brand new playground where her private tennis court had once been. A group of adults was leaving a job skills workshop in what used to be her private cinema. In the dining hall, people were sharing a meal, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. She had been the woman who had everything, a queen in a gilded cage, her worth measured in the cold, hard calculus of the market. She had commanded empires from behind glass walls, insulated from the raw, messy, beautiful truth of humanity. Now she possessed far less, yet she had infinitely more. She had found a wealth that did not diminish when shared, a power that did not corrupt when wielded with kindness, and a purpose that did not require public validation. The greatest fortune, she now understood, was not in what you could acquire for yourself, but in what you could become for others. In the quiet, knowing gaze of a gardener's daughter, Eleanor Vance had been stripped of her empire, and in doing so had finally gained the entire world.